Welcome back to Injuries Overcome. I have with me today Wycombe Wanderers midfielder David Wheeler. First of all, David, how are you? How are things in football?
Yeah, right. Yeah, we just played a League Cup game last night against Aston Villa. Lost 2-0, but we played really well, and on another day could have caused an upset. So yeah, and the season started fairly well for the team. I picked up an injury in pre-season, and kind of been coming back from that. So I've only played a couple of games so far.
Yeah, I've been following Wycombe quite a bit. I'm a Peterborough fan, so it's I believe I did speak to you actually in the game in the final at Wembley. I was one of the fans down there and stuff. So yeah, that was a tight game. But I guess sort of we'll talk about the start of your career. What was it like sort of playing that first game as a professional? Sum up your emotions in that. Is that the best it gets as a player? Obviously, you've gone on to do things like Player of the Year and stuff like that. Is it ranked the same, or is it as high as it gets?
Well, for me personally, it was terrifying the first game that I played professionally. Like, I think I'd played a few years in non-league, and I think the most I played in front of was maybe 1,000 fans. And then my first game was for Exeter against Bristol Rovers, and there was maybe 5,000 to 6,000. And yeah, I was absolutely bricking it. I was terrified, and yeah, so it wasn't a particularly enjoyable experience. Although afterwards we'd won, and then I could enjoy it a bit more afterwards. It was more the relief kind of thing.
Yeah, I suppose it's quite a daunting thing. I don't think people really think of it like that when you sort of come out and you go to that scale of fan base where there's more and stuff, and there's more on the line, because ultimately you're having your first game as a professional.
Yeah, and I think it was like a bit of a imposter syndrome type thing as well, where it was most of the guys I've played with either in academies or been playing professional football for years, and I'd been only playing in non-league, so it was jumping 2 leagues as well. So yeah, there was definitely a bit of imposter syndrome as well going with that.
Do you feel like you had a bit more pressure on you, not coming from the big academies and sort of making your way up through the lower leagues?
Yeah, but I'd say it was mainly self-pressure. I don't think I particularly got any pressure from anyone else. It was like, because I was a bit of an unknown quantity, and I don't think anyone was really expecting anything of me. So it was more my own pressure of wanting it to go as well as it could go, really, I suppose.
Yeah, and how do you reflect on that debut? Obviously, you've gone on to be a professional. You've made over 550 appearances, so I take it went pretty well then.
Yeah, I mean, so many ups and downs over the years, and yeah, I guess it was the determination, resilience, whatever you want to call it, to keep going and keep bouncing back from disappointments, I suppose. Because the highs are much less frequent than the lows in a professional football career generally.
Yeah, I suppose you sort of rank them if you go sort of pros and cons of what's happened. You find a lot more cons. Would you say that that's just down to sort of your ambitions to get better, or is it not so?
Yeah, I think definitely ambitions to get better, to always play at the highest level, play in the team, staying fit, and I think the majority of scenarios aren't the perfect scenario. Like, the only real perfect scenario is if you're fit and you start and you play well and you score and the team wins, and that's a lot of things to have to happen all at once. And I think there's a skill in maybe reframing or having a different mindset on what is success. Because I'd say the majority of footballers think that way, is that they're only really fully satisfied when all of those boxes are ticked.
So you would say then that once all those boxes are ticked, you're satisfied with whether it's a game or a season or a year?
Generally, yeah. Obviously, it's going to be different. A goalkeeper obviously would be clean sheet, or saving a penalty or whatever. So different positions specific, but yeah, I think by and large, you're only really properly chuffed after a game if all those boxes are ticked, which is a high bar to set, but I think it's quite common.
And obviously, as I said, you've had a long career, 550 games plus. Would you look back on your career and say you were fortunate with your injury history, or would you disagree with that? How would you view it?
I think it's very difficult to say either way, because I've had my fair share of injuries. I've had operations. I've had time out. There's been plenty of injuries and lots of different types of injuries. I've played with players that barely ever been injured, and I've played with players that get ACLs at the age of 20, and then that puts them on the back foot for the rest of their career. So there's been players that have had much bigger spells out injured that I know and have played with. So I don't think I can really say either way, to be honest.
That's a fair assessment. What was it like then when you first picked up your first injury, which sort of resulted in you not being able to play a game?
Well, yeah, probably could go back relatively young, I would imagine, like to sort of the time when I was playing at Brighton as a kid. And I would, it probably would have been age of 12, something like that. Going through growth spurts and getting bad back pain and that kind of thing. So yeah, probably back then my back was probably my most debilitating injury that I had at that age. Because I'd go into games and then have to come off after 10 minutes because my back had gone into spasm and I couldn't get out of my back spasm, and it's just very frustrating. And I remember that was quite a tough time.
Would you say then that's a common thing? Obviously, everybody gets growth spurts and stuff, but it's only recently I'm starting to hear from players that I spoke to before where they've said that was probably one of the difficultest times in their career, because you're trying to prove yourself to get into the professional game, but ultimately you're suffering from natural progression in your own body.
No, it was very common. I found, and if it wasn't your back, then it was quite often your knees. Luckily, I didn't have that issue with my knees, but a lot of players I know did, so some never got over it, and some it cleared up quite young. So, but yeah, that is, and that's, I'd say, obviously the growing pains is very much out of your control, but a lot of injuries are out of your control. About what your opponent does, about just the certain scenarios in the game where you might even score a goal, and then I played with a player who actually scored a goal, and the defender was flying across trying to block a certain goal and just missed. He scored the goal, but the defender went through his standing leg and broke his leg. So there's certain things in football you just can't legislate for.
Yeah, I suppose the sort of growing pains and stuff, as you said, is completely out of your control, even with not even doing anything. Would you say then that back then it was hard? Who was sort of the person or people that sort of helped you understand the reasoning? Because obviously if you're 12 years of age, you're going to struggle to understand sort of why you're being told, look, you can't play, because you're not fully understanding of injury or ultimately growth spurts.
Yeah, I think, to be honest, I think I was probably in the back end of the era where you weren't really stopped from playing ever. Very rarely. It was more the other way around. It was more on you to say if you couldn't play or not. So often there'd be players that were in quite a lot of pain at quite a young age that would just get themselves out there and try and play. So I think things definitely have got better in recent years with player care. But still there is that, and I don't know if that's just a male thing or a predominantly male thing where it's like not wanting to admit any weakness. But there's still a case where players will cart themselves out there when really they shouldn't be playing. And I've had many games where I've done that and got away with it, and the odd game where I haven't.
Yeah, so that was going to be my next question was, were you someone that would play through an injury or a pain that you felt where you sort of had an inkling that maybe I shouldn't, or were you someone that maybe here and there sort of understood maybe I need to take a step back and admit that I may be struggling, or were you someone that just said any minute they get a pain they're unsure about, no, that's me off for a game?
No, I was more the former. Like I generally try and, because I think just from experience, there's been plenty of occasions where I've been worried about an injury or getting injured or making something worse, and I've played and I've actually been okay. So I think because of that, I've tried to push through more often than not. But there was one occasion a couple of seasons ago where I had Achilles tendonitis, and it got so extreme that I was taking a lot of painkillers and I was taking injections to get through games. And I'd done that over a sort of 6-week period, and it got to the point where the painkillers and the injections weren't touching the sides anymore, and I was just still in quite an extreme amount of pain. And I just had to stop. I just had to stop and take time out and let it settle down.
And do you look back on that sort of thing? Because a lot of players I spoke to have said that the amount of treatment players have had, which I never knew, just to get through games, as you said, is so common. Do you regret doing that, or is that just something that you don't really think about? You did it because you wanted to play?
Yeah, it's mainly doing it because you want to play, but not wanting to lose your place in the team. If the team's in a really bad place or in a really good place, it's wanting to be out there to help, especially if you feel like you're the best person in that scenario to help. I mean, yeah, I've had sort of anesthetic acupuncture like in my back at times, like just because I could hardly move because of the pain, and managed to get through games. So like there obviously is a place for it if it's not going to put you in more danger, I suppose. If it's just a case of masking the pain momentarily, but yeah, it's a fine balance, and sometimes it's quite difficult to know where the line is.
And you sort of rely on those people like the physios and that sort of thing to highlight those things, or are you more aware of things, or has it changed as you've got older, where you've become much more, I suppose, you have more knowledge of the injuries that you could get or have got, that sort of thing?
Yeah, there's more. You have more knowledge from the experience, and like there's more specialist staff as well. And there's so much data in the game now as well, where you can see, if your running stats have spiked at a particular point, you're at higher risk of getting injury. So if you're getting pulled out of training early, then they'll just say that your numbers are too high. Like, we don't want you to risk getting an injury. So that can quite often happen, where for whatever reason you've had a particularly hard game or a particularly hard training session and you've run more than what you would normally or what everyone else has, then they'll be like, okay, you're finishing 10 minutes early, sort of thing.
Oh, wow, that's really interesting, actually. I've never ever been told something like that. So you could outperform and you feel nothing, but then you're told hang fire a little bit. Is it measured off of what your average is? So like you may run a certain amount and then it goes up and then that's that.
Yeah, I think your average, and also it'd be like your weekly average, but also your average for a game as well. So yeah, it's generally just measured off that.
Wow, okay. So obviously you've been at various teams in the different football leagues and non-league, obviously. Is there a big gap in the facilities that you've been involved with? Like, do you notice how much less there is lower down the leagues, or is it vary depending on the club?
It definitely varies depending on the club, because obviously, there was a time where you'd have teams like Bolton and Portsmouth in League Two, and a few years ago you had Yeovil in the Championship. So yeah, it certainly depends on the club. But yeah, I think a lot of it is staff. If the more staff you have, I think often makes it feel like you're much better looked after, and every player is catered for, and there's a lot more people that are invested in you doing well.
Yeah, I suppose you obviously notice the difference between playing at non-league and Wycombe now. What are the facilities like there? As much sort of detail as you can go into.
Yeah, I mean, with non-league, obviously you wouldn't necessarily train every day. When I was in non-league, it was you just train on Tuesday and Thursday nights, and there wouldn't be the requirement for a physio to be there all the time. And you might go in and get a strapping or a quick massage, but that would be about it. And the scope that the physio has with the equipment that they have is quite small in non-league. Whereas when you go into the league, there's not only the equipment that you have on site, but there's also they have private insurance for all the players. So if you need to, you can refer them to specialists. If there's a need of an operation or consultancy, then you can just refer them through the private insurance. So there's just that safety net really that just isn't there in non-league.
And do you find throughout your career, have you had maybe not cross words, but certain disagreements with physios and stuff? Like, for example, your time at Wycombe, where they're telling you one thing, but you feel the complete opposite, and you're still having to go with their decision.
Well, to be honest, most of the time, it's been a conversation. It's not been what I say goes type mentality. I think there has been frustrations over the years where I've been told that I can't train and I wanted to train. Or there's frustrations in feeling like your rehab is moving too slowly and you want to speed it up. But it's generally been a conversation. It's been like a teamwork type mentality, I'd say, in trying to get back fit.
So are you someone that sort of listens to the physio? Obviously everybody does, but listens and takes it on board and maybe doesn't go back at them? Because I'm sure there's players out there that do that, where they completely disagree and they push, and sometimes they might be all right, but other ways they could go the other way, and then you think like, well, that they were told something.
Yeah, no, it's pretty rare that's happened with me, I'd say. I think it's more if there's a decision to be made on whether to play a game or not because there's an injury and we're not sure if it's ready. I think that's when it becomes difficult, because there's differing opinions all the time on that. And obviously the player's ambition is always to play. And if you're being held back, it can be quite frustrating. But yeah, I think most physios I've had, if not all physios I've had in my career, it's pretty much always been a collaboration.
So let's move on to the deeper stuff. So what would you say is your worst injury you've had during your career? Obviously, I know you've had various surgeries, and I'm sure you might even talk about your time at QPR, because I've obviously done my research and know that there's been some frustrating periods for you.
Yeah, I mean, when I was at Exeter, I had two fairly major injuries. One was pubis osteitis, or pubis symphysis, whatever you want to call it, is just quite an extreme pain in like the pelvis area. And like every time you try and strike the ball with any kind of power or push off to sprint, it was like getting stabbed like in the pelvis, and it was that was pretty awful. And that was like weeks and weeks, I remember. And we were playing quite a chunk of the season again, and quite a lot of painkillers just because it was agony. So that was tough. And I remember we played Liverpool at Anfield in the I think it was the FA Cup, and I just remember coming off the bench knowing I was just going to be in like so much pain, and just obviously wanting to enjoy the experience, but just knowing it was going to be really tough. And then I had two surgeries on the same ankle for the same injury, which was really frustrating. especially the second time, I would say, when I'd signed for QPR in the Championship and started relatively well, and then was trying to fight to get back in the team, and then out of the blue just needed another operation, which has basically ended my season. And then because the manager then changed that brought me in, it was then kind of basically put paid to my career at QPR, unfortunately.
So talk to me then about that. So obviously you pick up the injury, you have the op, and you've obviously got that sustained period of time where you won't be playing. What goes through your mind, first of all, sort of before the surgery? Because like myself, I spoke to you before about this, having going into surgery with the mindset of you're not sure of the outcome was really daunting. So would you say you had that same issue? And talk to me about how you felt as you come out of surgery and then you were progressing on.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be tricky to cast my mind because I would imagine there's a lot that I've forgotten about that time. I think in some ways, weirdly, it's a relief when you have the op, because you just switch off. Because there's just no way you can play. There's no way you can be involved in any fashion, and not for a period of time. So you just switch off from the low level stress that you have week to week of being a footballer and having to compete every day. So on that level, there is some relief. But I think there were certainly moments of feeling like kind of useless, that you just not only of not being useful for the team and for the manager, but also not really being that much use at home because you're on crutches and you can't really move about very well, and you have to ask people to do certain things for you. So there's certainly that feeling a bit useless, and feeling, because obviously a big part of your personality is being an athlete and being active, and when you can't do that, it is really frustrating. So yeah, I think, but it's definitely a lot of ups and downs and questioning about how it's going to feel when you come back, and if you're going to be the same player when you come back.
Yeah, because I completely resonate with you on the sense of feeling useless, because if you're not able to do normal things, I certainly never, ever, ever thought about not being able to do things like walk or get out of bed properly. I remember when I come out of hospital, I'd have to have someone lift my leg off the bed and put it on the floor. So I was pretty much bedbound without someone coming to help me. What was that feeling like when you sort of you want to do things, you can't do them, and someone else has got to do them for you?
Yeah, no, it's obviously it certainly makes you grateful for the people that you have in your life. But again, there's that guilt there, where like the guilt comes in where you're inconveniencing people, or yeah, is that's definitely a factor.
Half of this, but we're back. I suppose we're just going to sort of continue on with what we were talking about before, about the feeling of uselessness when you're out injured and stuff, and not being able to do stuff on your own. What that, first of all, did you feel like that? And if so, what was that feeling like?
Yeah, definitely at times felt like that. I think I was quite fortunate that I've always been into other things, like other than just football, which I think helps a lot. I've done lots of studying, and been reading for a few years, like different things, and into sustainability and climate change and stuff. So yeah, that definitely helped the case. But even so, when I think most athletes probably, a big part of who they are is that they're very active and can get around and are very helpful generally. And the fact that I had to have other people doing things for me was difficult. I think it's sometimes quite difficult to accept.
Do you feel as you've got a bit older that it was easier to sort of deal with, or did you find it the other way around where you were younger and it was more frustrating?
I think it's actually It's not maybe not a helpful answer, but I think it's harder in some ways and easier in some ways. I think psychologically, it's easier in the sense that I can switch on and off from the game and my ambitions of what I want to do on the pitch easier now with experience and personal circumstances. But I think on a personal level, it's arguably harder because, if I see my wife struggling with the kids, like it's difficult if I'm, say, on the sofa and on crutches or whatever and can't get up and help immediately, then, and lots of things that would just be, I could do in a matter of seconds, like, changing the car seats in the car or whatever, I can't do. And it's just adds to the difficulty of her day. And I feel, an element of guilt for that.
I suppose then, would it be fair to say that having kids yourself, that when you are injured or you are unable to do certain things, that you almost feel that extra pressure because ultimately you're sort of the head of the family, you're the person they look up to for strength and stuff like that?
Yeah. I mean, not so patriarchal as that, but to a large extent, yes. Like there are the worries of, what's going to happen long term financially, because obviously as a player coming to the end of my career, it's one of those things where it's a high likelihood that I'm not going to be paid anything near to what I'm currently being paid. So it's that concern as well. And obviously the more injuries you get, the more severe injuries you get, probably the larger that worry is because people are going to second guess whether you're still able to do it. So yeah, it's being able to provide for the family, but also being able to just be available and able to help just with their everyday activities, really.
Now, obviously, you're currently at Wycombe Wanderers. What would you say has been your sort of biggest injury, and who at the football club specifically? Because you speak a lot about your family, about how they support you, but on the other side of things, who at the football club is sort of there as the sort of the biggest support mechanism?
Yeah, so fortunately, at Wycombe, I haven't had any major injuries. I've had a fair few minor injuries, but nothing that's kept me out for months at a time. I just made my 200th appearance for the club. So yeah, it's the case that I've played, near to 40, made near to 40 appearances every season I've been at the club. So that hasn't really been too big of a concern, but there has certainly been plenty of minor injuries. And even when I first signed for the club, I was coming off the back of an ankle operation when I was at QPR. And I was still having to ice my ankle every day when I turned up. And I think there was a little bit of concern, I think, from the staff at Wycombe when I first arrived, because I was, icing my ankle every day. And they were like, "Is this normal for you?" And I was like, "No, it's just, how it's feeling at the moment." But yeah, I think physios have always been very supportive. But I'd say, one of the biggest things was having a psychologist part-time at the club who, if ever you did get low, or if ever you did get really frustrated, even when you were fully fit, you could always draw on the psychologist to try and rationalize your own thoughts and organize your own thoughts in a way that's going to help you move forward in a positive way.
And what's that like, knowing that you may not necessarily need to use that support, but knowing that support's there? Is that quite key in the mental side of things when you are recovering from however minor of an injury it is?
Yeah, it's massive. And I think a lot of people that aren't in football can probably relate to that, in the sense that it probably takes quite a lot more effort, even just to pick up the phone and call a counsellor, or go and organise to see your GP and say you're really struggling or whatever. Whereas if someone's there on a day-to-day basis, and even on the side of the pitch or in the gym, and you can just quietly go, look, I'm really, really struggling at the minute. Like, can we have a one-to-one? Can we have a chat for an hour or half an hour or whatever? And it's amazing how that is often enough just to, lower the pressure cooker a little bit in your head and keep you on an even keel, really.
Now, as well, obviously, social media plays a huge part in people's mental health, whether that's good for good reasons or for bad reasons. Are you someone that's been active on social media? Are you someone that reads social media? Do you take any notice of it? Do you find it affects you in a negative way when you may be out injured and there's people, as they do, commenting injury and so on? Do you find it hard to sort of deal with, or do you ignore it?
I probably found it harder when I was younger. I think I hung off the words of and opinions of everyone a lot more than I do now. I think when I was younger, I used to trawl through fans forums, and if there was one negative comment about me, it would like really negatively affect my thoughts and feelings about how I was playing. Despite there being, a lot more people saying nice things, I would often fixate on the negative one. And yeah, there is the occasional time of getting caught up in social media comments and stuff, but I think I try to use it as little as possible generally, because I don't think it's particularly healthy. I'm just really on Twitter and LinkedIn. I'm not really on anything else. Facebook as well, but don't ever use it. And to be honest, Twitter I generally just use for politics, to in current affairs, keeping up to date with stuff, and LinkedIn just kind of making a record of the things that I've done, and the things that I've achieved and what I want to do. So it doesn't really affect me, I don't think, that negatively anymore. But I still think there's still room to do it less than I currently do.
Yeah, now obviously there's a lot of people sort of my age or younger that will be watching this, and they may be footballers, they may not. I've got a few friends who are starting their careers in the National League South and those sort of leagues, and what I've noticed from them is they say they get 100 odd comments of really positive feedback, but it's always that one negative one that affects them, and especially when they're out injured, you've got no control over the fact you're not playing, yet people still seem to insult it as though you're choosing to be injured, you're choosing not to be there. What would you say on that sort of logic?
Say again, sorry.
So what would you say in regards to that? So obviously, how do you I guess go about your day to day knowing that you're injured, you're not choosing to be injured, yet someone's telling you, oh, it's again, or just negative comments about that?
Yeah, that can quite often be harder than the comments about your performance, I think. Because like you said, you don't want to play badly, obviously, but no one wants to be injured. No one sets out to be injured, and often it's just complete luck or lack of luck that leads you to be injured. And if you kind of keep reading a narrative online that, oh, you're injury prone, then I think some part of you is going to start believing in that narrative, and kind of internalizing it a little bit, which I think is quite dangerous, because then you start overthinking things, you start behaving in a different way, you start maybe being a bit more cautious in training and games, and it affects your performance. So yeah, I certainly think that is definitely a thing that you can get caught up in, is not wanting to be stigmatized or have a label over your head in that way.
Now, as well, obviously, you spoke about hitting 200 appearances for Wycombe. You've had a really long career so far, and you've still got years ahead of you yet. Do you think then that your achievements and the success you've had in football sort of overcomes the thought of injuries that you've had? Do you feel like it's a bigger achievement because you've had surgery on your ankle and you've gone on to continue to play and achieve things?
Um, it's tricky, really, because it is a concern, and I do worry about, how my body's going to feel in 10 years, in 15 years down the line, whether just, playing with the kids is going to be a chore because, my knees or my ankles are going to swell up or whatever. So that does play on the mind. I've obviously pushed my body to the limit over 15 years or so, and more. And certainly there were times where I'd had injuries where I probably should have either rested or got an operation earlier or started rehab earlier and didn't because of the competitive element of it. It was like pushing through to try and make playoffs or getting through playoffs or just playing long enough so that we guarantee that we don't get relegated, and then I'll sort out my injury. Like all of those times obviously add up. So there is some concern about that, I would say, but also, yeah, like you kind of alluded to, that there's also all of the times where I've overcame injuries, whether that be long injuries like operations or week to week injuries where I've overcame them and played, or overcame them and scored, or had a successful season. And that's obviously all plays into appreciating perseverance and grit in the face of injury as well.
And what's that like then? Sort of, you've been out for however long you've been out, whether it's a long-term injury or a short-term injury, and you make your first appearance back on the pitch. What for you after your last ankle surgery? What was the first appearance? Was that starting or was that coming off the bench?
Coming off the bench.
And what was that like?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first time around, it may have been starting. I can't quite remember. But yeah, there's certainly some apprehension there. There's certainly, especially the second time, I think, because I was still feeling some after effects of the operation, still feeling some soreness and some stiffness and stuff. And it was the apprehension of like, is this going to get better? Like, is this going to make it worse? And also, am I going to be able to hit the level that I was at before the op? So yeah, that was the apprehension and the worry about coming back. And I think sometimes there's an element of you half forget how to move as a footballer, how to, manipulate the ball like at first, and that takes a bit of time to get fully back to where you were.
Yeah, and obviously, like you train most days, but it's a completely different scenario to then playing on a pitch in a competitive game where ultimately you may make a mistake and then that impacts your entire season.
Yeah, exactly. That's the thing. It's like it doesn't really matter what's going on in your personal life. It doesn't matter what's going on in your head. It doesn't matter how long you've been out. It doesn't matter how well you've done before. It ultimately, you're only really going to be judged on the game that you're currently playing or just played. And it's pretty unforgiving at times. And I think that's obviously adds to the pressure when you come back, is that a lot of the time you're not fully fit or at the very peak of your fitness. But people are judging you in the same way that they're judging everyone else that's playing or that have played, say 5, 10, 15 games already, and you're being chucked in and you've got to be at that level.
Yeah, and did you ever sort of think when you came on, was there any like difficult periods where you were injured and you come back, you didn't feel particularly up to speed yet? Obviously, you can't be because you haven't played the competitive football. But was there ever an element of, oh, I don't know if I want to do this, or maybe I should rethink whether this is the career I want and whether I want to come out of football? Did you ever have any of that?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, there was a period where I'd had an operation, my second ankle op at QPR, and I'd come back for pre-season, was still in a fair bit of pain, and ankle was still quite stiff, and I wasn't really going to get any football the following season at QPR, so I went on loan to Portsmouth, and was like pretty up and down with how my body was feeling at the time, and I wasn't really. I was struggling to break into the team. I mean, the team at the time was top of the league and doing really well, and the two lads in front of me were, scoring most weeks and doing really well, and so I was finding it tough to get in the team. And then I think I got a microfracture on that same ankle in a tackle, and I remember getting back in sort of early hours of the morning after a Tuesday night game, after doing, having that microfracture in my ankle, and sitting in the car and just like wondering if I wanted to do it anymore, because I'd had so much disappointment with injuries and not being selected, that I think I was maybe 28 at the time, or 29, and I was thinking, like, is this the time? Is this the time to stop? Because I'm not enjoying it anymore. I don't really feel like I'm at the level that I used to be. And I've got injured again, and I've got to go through a rehab again. And I was, genuinely contemplating retiring at 28 or 29 or whatever it was. And and that was quite a dark time. And I kind of was persuaded to give it one last shot. And that was by my old manager, Paul Tisdale, who persuaded me to come to play a few games for MK the back end of that season, and it kind of saved my career in a sense, because we ended up going really well and got promoted out of League Two, and I was, I played my part in that, and then signed for Wycombe the following season and got promoted the following season to the Championship. So it was kind of going from the brink of retirement really to ending up in the Championship, and feeling fully accepted and fully valued at a new club.
Yeah, I mean that to be honest, for me personally, that's blown my mind what you just said then, because you don't, as a fan or as someone who plays but doesn't play professionally, you never ever think of professionals having to go through that. And the reason I asked that question is because I'm never going to be able to play again, and I had to come to terms with that. But what a lot of footballers like yourself go through, you have continued ops, you're trying to play well, you're still feeling pain even though you've done all that you need to do, you've done the rehab, you've done the operation, and yet you still have to find that mentality and that positivity to keep going. Because as you said, it's such fine margins where you've said, I nearly quit, I didn't. Now you've played over 200 games for Wycombe after that, and you're not looking to stop now. You're still looking to continue. You're still playing this season. You've still got however many years ahead of you. So it's, I suppose then, do you think that footballers get the recognition for that side of the game that they should do, or do you understand why they don't get it?
I don't think they do get the recognition. But I understand why they don't, or why we don't, because obviously there are a lot of positives to being a footballer, financially being the most obvious one, but you're also paid to stay in really good shape. So health-wise, there's a lot of benefits, opportunities, status, the opportunities are quite considerable. And the benefits are quite considerable. So not that there's obviously, from some people there is a jealousy element, or an envious element, but I think it is understandable because of those reasons where it gets overlooked, like the difficulties of it. I mean, on the other side, there's a friend of mine who's a doctor, who's a surgeon, and so she obviously has a very high profile, very difficult and stressful job, where she has people's lives on the line, and she's multiple times said to me, I don't know how you do what you do, which is like, and I sometimes kind of laugh at that, because I think you literally have people's lives in your hands, but but she's kind of making the point that it's not just not the same, because I don't have 20,000 people, 30,000 people like bending over me, watching me do a suture or whatever, or every decision I make isn't critiqued like at a high volume before and after and every week. So yeah, there's certainly, I think it is very difficult for a lot of people to empathize, but so a lot of people do empathize with it, I think. And podcasts like what you're doing is very helpful in that, and that it shows that it isn't all plain sailing. And I think often that's a worry I have with a lot of young players and academy players, is that they see the shiny lights and the dream, which is great, but I don't think for them to be fully aware of the reality of the difficulties of the job, like injuries, like not being selected and all those things. I don't think that's a bad thing to make them fully aware. It's not gonna. I don't think it's necessarily going to be detrimental to pursuing the dream. If anything, it's going to prepare them better.
And do you feel like that education side of things, for not just the injuries, but as you said, the potential dark times that you could suffer as a footballer, do you feel like that has increased since your career, or
definitely. Yeah, it's definitely got better. And generally practices have got better, I think, especially in academies. But there's still a hell of a long way to go, and I think there's still a hell of a long way to go. I think, even just anecdotally, from what I've heard with Premier League teams, it's by no means a given that Premier League teams have a psychologist, for example, which is like crazy to think when you're paying players hundreds of thousands of pounds a week to perform at the highest level with the highest amount of pressure and stress, and you're not employing someone on, say, £100,000 a year to look after them and look after their mental health and help them with their performance. I think it's crazy, but we're still not there yet as an industry and as a country for some reason. For many reasons. But yeah, so I would say it's better, but there's still a hell of a long way to go, I think.
And are you someone now that, with the knowledge that you have and all of what you've said on this podcast, are you someone who the younger players in the squad you sort of look out for, or you give your experience on how things have changed for mental health in sport, with injuries, with all the other things that can come with it?
Yeah, I like to think so. I think if you ask most of the young players at Wycombe, I'm sure they'd feel able to speak to me about anything that they needed to, and ask for advice and stuff. And I try to make myself as approachable as possible, although it's always going to be difficult, I think, because often people feel more comfortable opening up to people on the same level as them. So I think, for example, like a senior pro would probably would almost certainly feel more comfortable opening up to me than they would a younger player, because there's that experience and life experience and football experience, comparison, whereas that we'd have in common. So yeah, you're never going to be. I don't think you're ever going to be like fully approachable and accessible to everyone as much as you would like to be, and I try my best to be that. But naturally, people gravitate towards different people.
So I guess now, sort of one of the final questions is what's next for you? Obviously, you're still playing. I assume you're looking to continue to play. But what's your next steps? Obviously, you're coming to the tail end of your career. What are you looking to do?
Yeah, I've done my master's in sports psychology, and I've started my training to be a sports psychologist, which is like for me a 3-year program. So my plan is to ideally play for at least that long. so another 2 years after this, whilst I'm figuring out what that life looks like as a psychologist. But that's the plan. But I'm also very interested in sustainability and climate change issues. So if an interesting opportunity comes up in that field as well, I'm certainly open to that. So there's a couple of things that I'm interested in doing. So yeah, I've done my UEFA B license in coaching, but that's probably third on the list for me at the minute of things that I want to pursue after football. Just because it's so all encompassing, and I've got a young family, and I don't feel at the moment that I want to compromise my time with my daughters and my wife at the moment, which is inevitably what you'd have to do if you're a manager.
So I guess the final question for me, which by the way, I've really enjoyed this podcast. I think you've given something that I've not heard in the previous podcast. Every guest comes on and gives a different angle, and I think there's 5 or 6 points I can think of in this half of the podcast that has sort of perked me up and made me listen more. What is your advice then for people like myself who 18 months ago, I didn't know what was going to happen, didn't know if I was going to have my leg, my life could be so different. What's your advice for people who aren't in the professional game, who are listening now, who are struggling with their mental health because of an injury, and ultimately they haven't got the resources that a professional would have?
Yeah, I think first and foremost, I would say it's important to be kind on yourself, and not beat yourself up too much, and not feel too guilty about things that are out of your control or have been out of your control. I think that would be a big one, because otherwise you're just, layering guilt on top of the disappointment, and it's just not going to help the situation. I would say don't be too proud to ask for help, whether that be your friends or people in football, and whether that be for some cheaper, discounted, or physio assessment, or access to just opinions in terms of rehab. And don't be afraid to ask for help, because generally I think people are really good with their time, especially if you're a good person. I think people are willing to give up time for you. So yeah, ask for help, I think, is another big thing. The classic phrase, control the controllables. Work out what's in your sphere of control, whether that be exercises you can do, gyms you can join, supplements you can take. What can you affect in your own life? Could you be sleeping more? The big ones. Can you change those for the better and see what happens? What else? And yeah, don't set yourself targets and goals that are so lofty and so far down the line that they're kind of undermining your mood on a daily basis. I think that's important. I think it's great to have a dream, but having a dream without a plan, or having a dream that's unrealistic for the time frame is probably detrimental. So I would say don't set a floor or a ceiling. Don't set yourself in order to be happy, I have to have played a game in the EFL. Well, what if you could play 100 games in the EFL? What if you could play 500 games in the EFL? What if you make the Premier League? What if you don't play any games? Like, is that what defines success or happiness? I think if you say playing Conference South, or National League South, is what they call it now, like, it's showing my age now, and you do your ACL and your rehab is not the same as what it would be if you were a professional footballer. because you don't get the same support or the same care. Success may be just getting back to the point where you can play footy with your mates and enjoy it, because that's the cards that life's dealt to you. You know, success can be different, and it's reframing that. I mean, I've had to reframe what success is throughout my career, I would say. So yeah, it's kind of trying, and you know, a phrase that probably gets overused is like, you know, the process, focusing on the process, trusting the process. Well, a friend of mine had a serious, I think it might have been an ACL injury. He's played, you know, all the way through the EFL and been to the highest of highs in the game. And he said he was relying on his journal, like he was doing a journal on his rehab. And he said that got him through his rehab, because he was getting to, you know, really dark place at times, and just seeing the progression in his journal that he's making from the reps that he was doing from 1 week to the next was a real source of encouragement and joy for him. So yeah, I think there are certainly tools that you can implement quite as simply, like a journal, and, you know, lifting the boulders, not the stones, like sleeping and eating properly, that can make a massive difference.